Imagine waking up one day to discover that the person you've been all your life wasn't entirely you, that the thoughts you thought were yours were planted, not chosen, that your preferences were shaped by old wounds you never noticed, that your daily routines were silently choreographed by a part of your mind you've never seen, a part that's always been watching, waiting, directing from the shadows. You sit at a red light, gripping the wheel harder than you should. The car ahead doesn't move fast enough. Your breath shortens. Why are you so angry? You tell yourself it's just traffic, but it isn't. It's a shadow. It's the voice you never hear, but always obey. You laugh at a joke in a group of friends, too loud, too eager. Later, you wonder, was that really me? Or a performance rehearsed 1,000 times in childhood? You look in the mirror before a date. You adjust your face, your tone, your boundaries, not because you want to lie, but because some ancient part of you believes the real me isn't lovable. You don't remember deciding this, but you live by it, and that is the unconscious. We move through life as if awake, yet the deeper truth is unsettling. Most of us are sleepwalking through our own stories, haunted not by ghosts in the attic, but by the ghosts in our own psyche. Patterns repeat, mistakes recycle, self-sabotage becomes ritual. We wonder why. We call it bad luck. We blame the world. But what if it's not the world at all? What if your suffering isn't random, but rehearsed? Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." But here's the cruel twist. The unconscious doesn't show up like a villain. It dances. It wears the masks of lovers, parents, enemies. It whispers through anxiety, depression, addiction. It lives in the stories you tell yourself to feel safe. It's not outside you. It is you, but the part you've locked in the basement, behind doors sealed long ago by pain. You weren't born with these shadows. You inherited them from your childhood, from your culture, from the wounds of those who raised you, the traumas you were too young to name, and the emotions you were told not to feel. And so you split. One part of you, the one who smiles politely, who chases goals, who says, "I'm fine," that's your conscious self. But there is another part. The part that rages silently when you're rejected. The part that flinches at intimacy. The part that sabotages joy because it doesn't trust happiness to last. That's the unconscious. And it is always dancing behind the scenes. But here's the riddle. If the unconscious is unconscious, how can you ever know it's there? If you're only aware of what you're aware of, then how can you ever awaken to what's asleep within you? What if your greatest acts of self-betrayal aren't mistakes, but rituals of survival created when you were too young to choose? Differently, what if the reason you keep ending up in the same relationships, the same jobs, the same moods, isn't because you're broken, but because some buried version of you still believes this is the only way to be safe? And what if the part of you that feels most ashamed is the key to your wholeness? This is the paradox. The unconscious both hides and holds the answers. It's where your wounds live, but also your wisdom. Where the pain is stored, but also the power. To journey into it is not a weekend retreat or a quick fix ritual. It is a descent, a dismantling, a dance with shadows yours. So the question is no longer, why am I like this? The real question is, who is the I asking that question, and who is the one hiding beneath it? Let's begin. We live in an age obsessed with consciousness, self-help, self-optimization, self-awareness. We meditate, journal, Take personality tests. We try to know ourselves, but beneath this shiny quest for enlightenment lies a blind spot. You can't fix what you can't see, and what you can't see still controls you. That's the root of the problem. The unconscious doesn't disappear just because we pretend it isn't there. It simply evolves into anxiety, addiction, perfectionism, indecision, avoidance, people-pleasing. It becomes the hidden hand shaping your relationships, your career, your sense of meaning. Carl Jung called this realm the shadow, not because it is evil, but because it is hidden. Everything we disown, repress, or refuse to feel becomes shadow. Every painful memory we bury, every anger we're told not to express, every desire we shame, every truth we fear. These fragments are not gone. They're just underground. And the more we avoid them, the more they influence us from behind the curtain. This is the trap of modern life. It teaches us to curate our surface selves, to be positive, productive, in control. But the deeper our performance, the greater the repression. We become strangers to our own soul. Think of a child who cries when they're hurt. If that child is punished for expressing pain, they learn crying is unsafe. So they stop crying. But the pain doesn't vanish. It becomes armor. It becomes control. It becomes a subconscious rule. Never show weakness. Fast forward 20 years. Now that child is an adult who can't ask for help, who avoids intimacy, who works obsessively to outrun a pain they no longer remember. This is how the unconscious works. Not as a spooky concept, but as a living archive of emotional blueprints. Your nervous system learned survival long before you learned language. It adapted, shaped you, protected you. But what protects you in childhood often imprisons you in adulthood. Psychologically, the unconscious isn't just a vault of forgotten memories. It's an entire ecosystem of beliefs, fears, defense mechanisms, archetypes. It's the unspoken why behind your compulsions. Why do you procrastinate the project you care most about? Why do you keep falling for people who can't love you back? Why do you sabotage good things when they start to feel real? Because some part of you buried, ancient, terrified, believes, if I succeed, I'll be abandoned. If I'm loved, I'll lose myself. If I stop trying, I'll be worthless. You didn't choose these beliefs. They were chosen for you by experience, by trauma, by repetition. And because they live in the unconscious, they operate on autopilot. They don't ask for your permission. They just steer your life and call it destiny. This is where philosophy meets psychology. The ancient Greeks had a word, daimona, kind of inner spirit, part guide, part curse. Socrates claimed his daimon whispered truths only he could hear. But for others, the daimon was darker, a force of obsession, inner torment, even madness. Today, we call it the unconscious. Freud saw it as a battlefield between primal drives and social rules. Jung saw it as the source of both neurosis and wisdom. Nietzsche saw the unconscious will not reason as the true force behind human behavior. He warned that we're not rational animals, but instinctual ones, who pretend to be rational. All these thinkers pointed to the same unsettling truth. We are not fully who we think we are. You can sit in therapy, write affirmations, visualize your goals, but until you bring the unconscious into view, you will keep circling the same patterns. And here's the paradox. The unconscious doesn't speak in logic. It speaks in symbols. It lives in dreams, slips of the tongue, strange cravings, irrational fears. It shows up in art, mythology, archetype. It hides in the stories we obsess over, the characters we identify with, the metaphors we use when we're too tired to explain ourselves. Why do some people always feel like imposters, even when they're loved? Because deep down, their unconscious tells a different story. Love must be earned. If I stop performing, I'll be forgotten. Why do others sabotage happiness? Because somewhere in their psyche, joy feels unfamiliar, even dangerous. They grew up with chaos, so calm feels like a lie. This is not a moral failure. It's a nervous system defense. It's a child's strategy in an adult's body. To make matters worse, society rewards the mask. It promotes success stories that ignore the shadow work behind them. It glorifies productivity while pathologizing rest. It teaches children to compete, but not to feel. To chase status, but not to know themselves. So we build lives on top of unhealed foundations and wonder why they crack under pressure. We keep asking, what should I do with my life? But the deeper question is, what parts of myself have I exiled in order to survive? Because those exiled parts, they don't go quietly. They become symptoms, addictions, burnout, numbness, explosions of rage, or, more often, the quiet ache of a life that looks fine but feels hollow. The philosopher Alan Watts once said, "You are an aperture through which the universe is looking at and exploring itself. But if your lens is fogged with unconscious fear, you won't see clearly. You'll think your trauma is reality. Your coping is your personality. Your wounds are your worth. But none of that is true. And here's where the hope lies. What is unconscious can be made conscious. And when it is, not only does suffering transform, but you transform. You begin to reclaim your choices. You begin to rewrite the script. You stop reacting from old wounds and start responding from a deeper wisdom. But to do that, you must be willing to turn inward, not just for insight, but for integration. And that begins with a descent. We live in a culture addicted to surfaces. We're taught to run faster, think smarter, stay positive, and distract ourselves from discomfort. The moment life feels heavy, the prescription is always the same. Do more, be more, optimize yourself. But beneath that surface hustle lies a quiet, persistent ache, feeling that something essential is missing. This ache is not a flaw to be fixed. It is an invitation. Carl Jung called this invitation the descent. Not a fall from grace, but a conscious, turning inward, a courageous journey into the depths of your own psyche. It is the soul's rebellion against superficiality. The moment when your inner world refuses to stay buried any longer. But what does it actually mean to go within? It means stopping the performance. It means choosing to face the emotions, memories, and questions you've been avoiding for years, perhaps your entire life. It means sitting with grief without numbing it, feeling shame without escaping into ego, touching loneliness without immediately reaching for distraction. It is raw, it is humbling, and it is the only way to meet the parts of yourself you've lost. The descent is not linear. It doesn't follow a 5-step formula. There is no checklist, no guarantee, and no promise of comfort. It often begins with a breakdown, a job loss, a divorce, an illness, a panic attack in the middle of a supermarket. A moment when the structures that held your identity collapse. You find yourself on your knees, stripped of titles, certainty, and control. It feels like death because, in a sense, it is. The death of the false self. But underneath that collapse, something deeper begins to stir. You start to dream again. Not of success or status, but of symbols, archetypes, shadows. Your unconscious begins speaking in images. A black wolf at your doorstep, a burning forest, a locked door. These aren't just strange nighttime visions, they are messages, clues, from the parts of your psyche that have long been exiled. To go within means to stop dismissing these messages. Jung believed that the unconscious was not chaotic, but intelligent. It holds exactly what the conscious mind cannot yet face. That's why it speaks in symbols it knows truth must be approached sideways, not head-on. So you begin the descent, like a mythic hero not slaying dragons, but sitting with them. You journal your dreams, you feel your triggers, you watch what makes you collapse into rage, or numbness, or silence, and slowly, patterns begin to emerge. You realize the fear you feel in conflict isn't just about the present rooted in a childhood where anger meant abandonment. You see that your people-pleasing isn't kindness, it's survival. You discover that your endless drive for achievement is covering up a belief that you're unworthy, unless you're producing. This is the painful gift of the descent. It reveals the why behind the who. It shows you the architecture of your identity, just who you've become, but how that self was built in response to trauma, environment, and unconscious belief systems. And once you see it, you can no longer unsee it. That's where the descent deepens, because awareness alone isn't enough. Now you must choose. Will you cling to the familiar, or will you descend even further into the places where healing begins? This means confronting the inner child, the abandoned parts, the protector parts, the shameful parts. It means seeing your entire psyche as a family system, some members loud, some exiled, all trying to keep you safe. You may find yourself weeping for the 80-year-old version of you, who learned to stay small because love felt conditional. You may rage on behalf of the 15-year-old who never felt seen. You may grieve the creative, sensual, wild parts of you that were shut down for being too much. And you'll be tempted to rush through it, to fix it, reframe it, transcend it. But healing doesn't work like that. Healing is not a spiritual bypass. It's not a bypass at all. It is a descent into the body, into breath, into the tears you never cried, into the primal howl that lives beneath your politeness. It is remembering that your emotions are not enemies, they are ancient messengers. And when you finally stop resisting them, they begin to show you the way. You begin to feel more real, more embodied, less like a floating head trying to manage life, and more like a rooted soul experiencing it. But make no mistake, this process will cost you. You may lose relationships that were built on your silence. You may outgrow environments that once felt like home. You may find that your old ambitions no longer excite you. This is not regression. It is transformation. The descent isn't about becoming something new. It's about shedding everything you're not. It's the slow burning away of masks, roles, and coping mechanisms that once kept you safe, but now keep you stuck. And as you burn, you begin to uncover something deeper, the voice beneath all the noise, the self beneath all the selves. And this voice doesn't speak in commands or self-help cliches. It whispers, it nudges, it feels like truth in your bones. It says, you are allowed to rest. You are allowed to grieve. You are allowed to want more. You are allowed to stop performing. Most of all, it says, you are not broken. You are remembering. This is what it means to go within. It is not a glamorous process. It will not win you applause, but it will give you something far more valuable than external validation. It will give you yourself, and that your wholeness, your truth, your alive. worth the descent. Because once you've met the self within the shadows, nothing outside of you can ever define you again. Now imagine, just for a moment, that you could enter that labyrinth of the unconscious, not as a prisoner, but as a cartographer. Not as a fugitive running from the shadows, but as an alchemist transforming the very darkness you feared into gold. This is the rebellion. It begins not with grand epiphanies, but with the quiet courage to sit still, to stop chasing certainty, success, or even healing, and simply turn inward. As Jung once wrote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The first act of rebellion, then, is radical. Attention to your dreams, your compulsions, your triggers, your slips of the tongue. Every fragment, every discomfort, is a whisper from the unconscious trying to be heard. You may have spent your life polishing the surface of your personality, curating a version of yourself the world could admire. But this rebellion asks something more dangerous: authenticity over approval, integration over performance. Not the self you show at dinner parties or interviews, but the self that wakes you at 3 a.m., unsettled and aching, whispering that something's missing. Start there. Carl Jung's process of individuation, the journey toward psychological wholeness, is not a neat climb, but a spiral descent into the unconscious. It requires facing what you've banished, the parts of you labeled bad, irrational, too much, or not enough. What if, instead of medicating your anxiety or bypassing your shame with positivity, you asked, why are you here? What are you trying to protect? This rebellion isn't self-help, it's self-confrontation, and strangely, it is through this confrontation that healing emerges. Take, for example, the archetype of the wounded healer. According to Jungian thought, the healer is not someone untouched by pain, but someone who has allowed their wounds to become portals, gateways to empathy, wisdom, and transformation. Your trauma doesn't have to define you, but it can refine you if you have the courage to walk back through it. The modern world sells us illusions of control, certainty, and perpetual progress. But the unconscious doesn't obey linear logic. It speaks in images, patterns, and paradox. To break free from its grip, you must learn its language. That means listening to your dreams, not dismissing them as random noise, but mining them for symbolism and insight. It means recognizing when you're projecting your inner wounds onto others, blaming your partner, your job, your family, when the real battlefield is within. The rebellion also involves embracing ritual and embodiment. You can't think your way into wholeness. The body remembers what the mind forgets. Trauma is stored not only in neurons, but in fascia, breath, posture. Practices like breathwork, somatic experiencing, expressive arts, even silence, these can become keys that unlock the doors the ego sealed shut. But perhaps the most powerful act of rebellion is to abandon the pursuit of perfection altogether. We are taught to see flaws as failures, to measure our worth by how seamlessly we can present ourselves. But the unconscious sees through the mask. The parts you hide, the rage, the grief, the absurd desires, are not impurities. They are raw materials for the soul's evolution. Real freedom lies not in eradicating the shadow, but in weaving it into your story with honesty and grace. Consider this: what if your compulsions, your self-sabotage, your repeated patterns, what if they weren't signs of weakness, but encrypted messages from the parts of you still waiting to be integrated? What if healing isn't about getting rid of those parts, but loving them into wholeness? This is what Joseph Campbell called the hero's journey. But unlike the myths of slaying dragons or conquering kingdoms, the real dragon is internal. The treasure isn't gold, it's truth. And the journey ends not in applause, but in quiet inner alignment. The rebellion will make you less normal. You may outgrow people who only knew your mask. You may stop chasing things you once thought essential. You may find yourself crying over old wounds or laughing at the absurdity of your own illusions. But you will also begin to feel again, to breathe more deeply, to speak more honestly, to live less as a role and more as a soul. And when you meet others still trapped in their own unconscious loops, you won't preach you'll understand, because you've been there, you are there, and you've chosen, despite the risk, to dance with your shadows instead of fearing them, because rebellion, in its deepest form, is not destruction, it is reclamation. Reclaiming your pain, your instincts, your lost voice, your forgotten joy. All of it so, when the shadows come end, they will you no longer run. You bow, you listen, and you begin to move with them, not as an enemy, but as an equal. After all the digging, dreaming, confronting, and unraveling after, facing the shadows, burning down illusions, and walking the long road inward, arrive at a paradox. There is no final destination. The self isn't a fixed identity waiting to be discovered like a hidden treasure. It's not a product of perfect discipline, nor a prize earned through moral purity. The self is a dynamic process, ever evolving, forever incomplete. And the most powerful realization is this: you are not here to become someone. You are here to remember who you are. Beneath all the masks, roles, trauma adaptations, and social conditioning lies something ancient and indestructible, a core untouched by chaos, a quiet knowing. Some call it the soul, others the self with a capital S. Jung called it the totality of the psyche. Whatever name you choose, its truth is the same. You were never broken, only buried. Modern life, loud, fast, and relentlessly external, seduces us into forgetting. It sells you 1,000 ways to fix yourself, upgrade your life, or transcend your pain. But healing, in its truest form, is not about addition, it's about subtraction, peeling away everything you were taught to be, until all that's left is raw, radiant presence. In this space, the unconscious is no longer your jailer. It becomes your guide. Dreams shift from confusion to conversation. Triggers become trailheads. Emotions stop being problems to solve, and instead become messengers with gifts. You no longer resist the dark, because you understand it's where the gold is hidden. As Jung warned, the gold is in the shadow. You begin to see that even your suffering had intelligence, that the wounds you thought disqualified you from wholeness were actually the initiation, the heartbreak that shattered you. It cracked the false self wide open, the anxiety that crippled you. It pointed to a truth you were avoiding, the shame you carried like chains. It wasn't yours to begin with, it was inherited, absorbed, mistaken. For identity, the final realization is this: the self isn't something you construct, it's something you reclaim, and the reclamation is not heroic in the way we imagine. It's humble, it's messy. It's sitting in silence with your inner child and whispering, "I'm listening now." It's saying no when you've been conditioned to say yes. It's letting go of the performance. It's weeping over things you never gave yourself permission to mourn. Its joy, too deep, quiet joy that comes not from achievement but from alignment. Joy that doesn't need validation. Joy that bubbles up simply because you are living in integrity with your own soul. And perhaps most profoundly, This realization changes how you relate to others. When you've met your own shadow, you stop demonizing the shadows of others. When you've made peace with your inner chaos, you no longer demand perfection from the world. Compassion becomes less of a virtue and more of a reflex. Judgment melts. Empathy deepens. Because you know every person you meet is fighting a silent war in the trenches of their own unconscious. You become less reactive, less performative, less addicted to outcomes, and more alive, not in the sense of constant happiness, but in a deeper sense of aliveness, of being present in your body, responsive to your instincts, honest with your pain, and open to beauty in all its strange, fleeting forms. This is the essence of soul retrieval. Not a mystical event, but a lifelong practice of returning again and again to the parts of yourself you left behind. And with each return, you carry one more lost piece. Back into the light in the end. This journey into the unconscious is not a detour. It's the path home, and maybe that's the most powerful truth of all. You were never meant to transcend your humanity. You were meant to inhabit it fully, fiercely, and without apology. So dance with your shadows, sing with your scars, honor your longing, because underneath it all, you are already whole. You just forgot.